The Onside CFL Fantasy Football Podcast, episode number 9. Lower your weapons by Revolution Engine, bringing us in, as always, the band of engineer Ben Bussey, which, by the way, we just want to say tonight, he and producer Dan Hindmarsh will have a special appearance a little later on. Available on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and TuneIn as well. Dave Dawson, Dan the Stats Guy, thanks so much for joining us this weekend, each and every week. And Dan, I think a good way to start it off, how many objects should we throw at engineer Ben and see if they will actually stick tonight?
Well, as many as it's going to take, look at certain teams and they just fire the ball as much as possible and see if anything lands. Fire away. Like
Ryan Smith, who somehow caught a ball that he wasn't even looking at as a chalkboard just flew at engineer Ben, and he dodged it, or is that a wallet? Either way, some exciting stuff going on throughout the games on the weekend. Yeah, we talked a bit about Ryan Smith. A lot of different things to get through here this week. Dan and I, as always, Dan put a lot of work in behind some of the top performers, some of the busts over the last week in daily fantasy sports. We got some highlighted tweets. And Dan, one thing I'm really excited about was this. You and I are always a fan of the Twitter trash talk. There's one group of guys that took it to a new level this week.
Those are the fun leagues where the guys are willing to get out there and make fun of each other and have a little bit of fun with it. Guys in our league, if you're listening, let's get the trash talk going in our league, because it seems like everyone's a little bit too polite with each other. This was fun to watch last Wednesday as these guys went at it on Twitter and really didn't hold back with what they said to each other.
Yeah, and we'll have that highlighted later on in social media. As always, you can subscribe to our DFS rankings, which come out each and every Tuesday. Dan and I put those out for you, and you can see those onsidecfl.wordpress.com. And you know what? To go along with that, Dan and I were both pretty impressed by the BC Lions defense in the first couple of weeks. Dan, big thumbs down to the Lions this last weekend. What happened?
Well, we'll talk about it in the injury segment and also in the matchup segment for this week. A big difference maker for the BC Lions, and it showed last week. Mikael Brooks, the defensive tackle for the Lions, he was out of the lineup, and you could really see the difference that he makes. Brandon Whitaker ran all over their defense, and I think that is the number one reason why Whitaker had such success last week, is that injury to Brooks. Brooks is a second-year guy, comes from an NFL pedigree, spent time with the Seattle Seahawks in their Super Bowl championship year. It looks like he's on his way back to the NFL after this year, and he's one of the premier players in the CFL. Without him there, suddenly our prediction of the BC Lions being the top defense went to nothing. And, that's a big one to look for as far as the injuries go.
Great segue in injuries. And you can obviously, like I said, check all it out on onsidecfl.wordpress.com. $20 for a year's subscription to our DFS, a season subscription, I should say, to our weekly DFS rankings. Injuries. Montreal Alouettes were on the bye last week. They're back in action this week, but who's going to be slinging the gun? That's the big question. Kevin Glenn, quarterback, looked like he had a bit of an eye inflammation, not to mention an ankle injury, missed practice today. And who was the one taking the snaps?
Rakeem Cato, a player out of Marshall University, of course, last year in his debut season in the CFL, was put into the starting job fairly early on. He made an impression. Obviously, they bring in Glenn late in the season, but if Cato's going to go, it'll be a different-looking Montreal offense. That was kind of the discussion on Twitter on Monday, was how will this Alouettes offense look differently, and we'll get to the other injuries as well. But if Glenn can't go, Rakeem Cato will be a lot different. I think Kevin Glenn, for the most part, tends to stick to the pocket, sort of do those short yardage, high percentage passes. A guy like Nick Lewis is a big beneficiary of those passes. You take S.J. Green for sure out of the mix. Kenny Stafford also with the broken toe, and the possibility of Duron Carter's suspension being upheld, and it could have a completely different look to it. I said in this case of Cato, he could be a lot more of a mobile quarterback and also could use the replacement of Tyrell Sutton out of the backfield, Brandon Rutley, in a little bit more of a passing kind of a play as a check down receiver. Rutley, a big-time receiver in college as a running back. He has the all-time record for receiving yards for a running back at Northwestern University. So we're excited to see Rutley, and I know you probably even more so than me, Dave, with how high you are on that running back.
Keeper in my fantasy league, I expected Tyrell Sutton. You know, if he could stay healthy, he's one of those guys that's a top 1-2 in the league each and every year in rushing. But Brandon Rutley got some good hands and a quick first step, which could be a factor into BJ Cunningham. Look for him. We spoke a lot about him in the past weeks and at the end of last season as well. Looked really good, and BJ Cunningham will be a big guy that keep your eye on this week. As Dan did say, Kenny Stafford on the 6th game with a broken toe. A couple of guys that Dan was high on last week that we may see in the lineup coming in for this week as well.
Yeah, Chandler Jones, a product of San Jose State University in his rookie season, and Corbin Laux, also a rookie. They're going to be battling all week for that extra receiver job. The Alouettes also signed to the practice roster Jacoby Ford, who went to training camp with the Edmonton Eskimos. And on Monday as well, they also signed veteran CFL receiver Marcus Henry to a contract. I think for this week, you're not going to see Ford or Henry in the lineup, but look for Chandler Jones or Corbin Laux. And as the depth chart comes out midweek, watch for their names, see who's going to be starting. Obviously, the big one's going to be BJ Cunningham, regardless of whether Duron Carter is going to be in or out. Cunningham is going to fill one of the receiving slot back positions left vacant by S.J. Green or Kenny Stafford. A lot of people think that Nick Lewis is going to have massive value now. The response I have with that one, as far as Nick Lewis goes, is that what you see with him is what you're going to get. He's more of I think, a tight end than anything. Wouldn't you agree with me, Dave?
Yeah, absolutely. He would. Him and Kevin Glenn have this unspoken respect for each other, and he's that blanket, that check down player, for lack of a better term, or that the security blanket is the word I'm looking for. He sees Nick Lewis, he develops the chemistry, kind of like Kevin Glenn did with Marquay McDaniel years ago as well. But if you put Rakeem Cato into the mix, spreading the ball around, a guy like Alex Charrette is activated off the 6th game. Could see him come into some game action in coming weeks. He's a guy to keep in your back pocket as well. But a guy like Nick Lewis, he's reached his ceiling at his age and where he's at. Don't expect 1,000-yard season out of Nick Lewis, but he will be prone to some big games time to time, but don't expect a 100-yard performance each and every week. And with Duron Carter potentially playing this week with the appeal and no real word on the recording time on Monday night, whether or not the situation is there. Duron Carter, there's this funny conversation on Twitter. Duron Carter says he has a concussion. The Alouettes say he says he doesn't. So regardless, by the time the depth chart is out on Tuesday, Duron Carter may or may not be a factor into that game.
And just jumping back in there with Nick Lewis, as far as looking at last year's stats with him, there was maybe, I think, 2 or 3 plays of over 20 yards to Nick Lewis. Everything was of the 5 or 6 yard variety. Throw it to him, get those yards after the catch. But with him, you're not going to see him go on any deep slants or any kind of deep routes. He's going to be a guy that they're going to use on kind of short yardage passes, and really treat him like a tight end if you are used to playing an NFL format. But don't expect him to be a top flight receiver. He'll get lots of targets, so he will get those points as far as for receptions in DFS, but just don't expect him to get a high average as far as yardage on each catch.
We noted a lot of those were in garbage time last year too, to keep that into a factor. He's not a primary target, but he will see some touches, just mostly in garbage time. And those new to the CFL fantasy game, that's usually at the end of a game when a game's out of reach and a team's defense has backed off considerably. Moving on to Hamilton Ticats, one of the very few teams with minimal injuries. Rico Murray, the Sam linebacker for the Ticats, and I know Dan has drafted this guy a few times in the past and has a personal soapbox on this guy who's battling a knee injury.
Yeah, watch for his status going on to the weekend. He plays the Sam linebacker spot. If he's unable to go, Johnny Sears has played that position in the past, so you could see some shifting, possibly seeing Dominique Ellis moving into a starter's job.
The BC Lions, Jeremiah Johnson, battling an ankle injury. We saw Anthony Allen fill in very respectably last week, and Mikhail Brooks, as we mentioned off at the top, an ankle injury. Brian Turner was in there, and oh boy, was there ever a difference on the run defense. Saskatchewan, Jonathan Williams, looks like he's going to be on the 6th game, but from what it looks like, their interior, their whole front four, the way Chris Jones has put that together, not a whole lot of concern there.
Yeah, made a deal on the weekend, acquired Cedric McKinley from the Edmonton Eskimos, and McKinley has played in Jones' system, obviously in Edmonton. He'll immediately go into a starter's job. The Rough Riders kind of did a rotation. There's a few times where they were just in a 3-man system, but watch for McKinley to move in there. He was a backup in Edmonton, but he'll be firmly entrenched as a starter with the Rough Riders going forward.
Quincy McDuffie, the kick returner for the Bombers, missed practice on Sunday, but according to Darren Bombing from TSN 1290 Winnipeg, Coach Mike O'Shea was saying that he should be good to go for the game. Tim Flanders handled the kick returns on Sunday. Adrian Hubbard, left arm, looked like he got some work. He was in place of Sheon Green. Hubbard flat out beat Sheon Green for the job here on in. So if you're in long format fantasy, Sheon Green isn't a guy I would look at anymore. I would go for Hubbard. And Dan Cleal-Bass, a guy that you've owned in the past, has missed practice on Sunday. Sam Hurl was in his spot, but hopefully, from what Mike O'Shea says, he'll be good to go for Thursday's game.
Yeah, that'll be a big one, especially when you have a mobile quarterback like Mike Riley. We'll talk about it in the matchups, but Mike Riley, probably, as far as I'm concerned, probably the biggest threat as far as a quarterback for rushing yards. And if Khalil Bass isn't 100%, you could see Mike Riley take off with the ball a few times himself and get some yards on the ground. If Bass isn't able to go, the Bombers have had Sam Hurl on the 1-game injured list. I'm hoping that maybe Hurl would be healthy enough to come in, but it doesn't look like Bass will miss the time. And then the last one for the Bombers, obviously, is Bruce Johnson, who missed last week. Travis Hawkins filled in. He was benched, and now it's looking like the possibility could be C.J. Roberts could be brought on from the practice roster to start in that place. And then one other injury with the Bombers to watch for also that we'll talk about in the matchups is the injury to Johnny Adams. He continues to miss time for the Bombers. Once he's back, he'll take Kevin Fogg's position on the corner, and that could make a big difference. You've seen the primary receivers for each team really pick on Kevin Fogg on the outside, and when Johnny Adams comes in, that will help that Bombers defense, and I think will take away some of the potential for big plays through the air. And so that's one to watch for as well, as if Johnny Adams starts to get healthy for the Bombers, they could have a different look to them.
Took the words right out of my mouth. As soon as you said Kevin Fogg, that was the first thing I thought of, and people who have been watching a lot of CFL probably are nodding their heads going, yeah, I've been watching that too. In Edmonton, Alex Hoffman-Ellis came over from the Lions to Hamilton, and now he's an Edmonton Eskimo. Looked pretty good backing up J.C. Sherritt, backing up Dion Lacey in game last week against the Riders, but torn right bicep added to the 6-game list, which is a tough pill to swallow for Alex Hoffman-Ellis.
Yeah, I think in that one, Jason Moss and Ed Hervey were hoping that the Eskimos could bring Hoffman-Ellis in there and have him compete with Dion Lacey for that weak side linebacker job. And then that would give them a little bit of flexibility of moving Lacey up to a defensive end position and use him as a little bit more of a pass rusher. Now they're not afforded that opportunity, but as the season goes forward, if Hoffman-Ellis is able to come back late in the season, perhaps you're going to see that where Hoffman-Ellis moves into a little bit more of a traditional linebacker role and Lacey bumps up to the defensive end. But a tough break for the Eskimos as they had high hopes for Hoffman-Ellis.
Arguably one of the best names in all of football, Forrest Hightower. I automatically think of Police Academy, don't you? When you hear the Hightower name, it's Producer Dan's nodding, and Engineer Ben.
Well, my favorite thing with Forrest Hightower, and I think a lot of people have laughed and kind of rolled their eyes maybe a little bit too, is the CFL website. Forrest Hightower, I believe, is about 190 pounds, and for most of last season, he was listed as a defensive lineman for the Red Blacks, which every time I looked, I thought, man, this guy's going to get beat up if he's 190 pounds and playing defensive tackle. But sure enough, he is a defensive back, and he's out with a head injury. He's not going to play this week on Wednesday, and according to Red Blacks play-by-play guy AJ Jakubek, Brandon Sermons, who is a veteran with the Red Blacks, will take the field side corner in the game on Wednesday.
Josh Mitchell, defensive back, lone injury for the Argos over the weekend, and doesn't really cosmetically may cause any major issues for the Argonauts. So Lamar Durant missed week 2, and he got extended actually to his injury status right up till next week, but the Stamps are on bye week anyway. Simone Charbonneau-Campeau has filled in since then, Durant with a sprained injury. And those of you in long format and even in DFS kind of fell in love with Lamar Durant early.
Yeah, Durant is a Canadian, and he gives them that ratio boost that they're looking for with another starter in their receiving group. And that sprained ankle, obviously on that big play where it was a deep ball that he fell, sprains his ankle. The bye week will help. Hopefully he can come back in the weeks to follow and take back that slot back starting job. Another receiver that also suffered an ankle injury, and that was in last week's game in Ottawa, is Joe West, the weak side receiver for the Stampeders. I would have to think the Stampeders, Bakari Grant obviously was the one that people saw this last week as he came into the starting lineup, taken away from Dave's man crush Kamar Jordan. Bakari Grant is type of receiver that can shift all over the field. I would have to think if West isn't able to go next week, that Bakari Grant would shift to the outside and Kamar Jordan would return to the lineup. Another option is Greg Wilson to come off the practice roster, who's also a veteran with the Stampeders.
And a backup man crush. I really expect Greg Wilson, if he gets in the lineup this year, I'm excited to see what he can do. Quinn Smith, defensive lineman, shoulder injury, missed week 3. Derek Wiggins started in place for him. And a couple of big injuries. I would say arguably the Stamps' biggest offseason signing was right down the middle. And since the Stamps didn't practice on Monday, no word on how long he's going to be out.
Yeah, Taylor Reed, and then also the injury with Duron Mayo in that fourth quarter and going into overtime for the Stampeders. Both linebackers were kind of in and out off the field. Alex Singleton, the Stampeders draft pick this season, came in and he filled in for those. So that's going to be one to watch for, especially for those that are playing the head-to-head season-long format, whether or not Taylor Reed or Duron Mayo might be out, and it could also affect how their team performs as a defense next week.
All right, every Monday morning you can check out the injuries onsidecfl.wordpress.com. Looking at top performers of last week, and boy, that Riders-Eskimos game, that was a shootout. That was fun to watch. Taking her into overtime, back-to-back OT games on Friday night. And Mike Riley, the creme de the creme. If you were an owner of Mike Riley, you cashed in last week.
Yeah, 34.92 points, and the other quarterback, Drayon Durant, 33.18 points, and that's the beauty of getting those overtime games. You get free points added to your score. So those two guys at the top of the list, and then Trevor Harris continues his string of great performances, 31.04 points for the Red Blacks against the Calgary Stampeders. So 3 quarterbacks over 30 points. Obviously, 2 of those came with a pretty hefty price tag, over $10,000, but they both paid off.
Trevor Harris threw his first pick of the season. Yeah, that guy can be not perfect. Unbelievable. Running backs, just as we had predicted, Anthony Allen right at the top because of the Jeremiah Johnson, 24.9 points. Brandon Whitaker, 22.2 for the Argos. And John White, a guy we always have ranked pretty high at 20.3 points for the Eskimos.
Yeah, John White continues to go with this strong performance early in the season. And if you had seen on our Twitter account on Monday afternoon, we touched on the number of carries and targets that running backs got. John White right at the top of that. He continues to be used by that Eskimo offense in both the rushing role and in the receiving game. So watch for that going forward. They've got a favorable matchup this week with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers.
And a keeper of mine in our long format fantasy football, and I'm reaping the benefits right now, and I'm probably only beating people by a considerable amount because of this guy, Chris Williams, 44.4 points, a hat trick on the weekend.
Yeah, and joined with the hat trick club by Adarius Bowman with over 41 points. Both those guys at the top of our list, and it was one of those things that I think a lot of people. In the case of Chris Williams, you looked at it and that price tag, how can I justify it? And I know he continues to go up, gets up to an $11,000 value for this week. Can you keep going with Chris Williams? Well, until he shows that he can produce those, you got to keep drafting him every week on DraftKings because he just keeps performing in that big way. And he's the type of receiver that could do it in multiple ways, whether it's short patterns and he makes moves in the open field or on deep routes. And I've said it time and time again on Twitter. He's the Antonio Brown of the CFL because he can do it all. He also contributes in the return game. And if you feel like, especially if there's a cheap quarterback option, why not keep running with Chris Williams?
Why not? Can't go wrong there up until their bye week in week 6. Ricky Collins and the Riders looking pretty good, 26.5. Had a bit of a circus catch there. And Brandon Banks, 22.5, taking one all the way back to the house. Got you some big points if you had him.
Yeah, 120-yard missed field goal return that he takes to the house. Not much else on the offensive game, but if Brandon Banks can continue to be the big kick returner, he can be a great flex option for your DraftKings team.
From the very first possession, it seemed like Greg Ellingson was going to have a big game. Trevor Harris continually targeted him again and again and again. 22.1 points, and obviously that tie game that we did see there. And Greg Ellingson, going forward, could have himself a respectable season.
The one that's interesting for us, and as we've been kind of talking the last couple of days with who we're going to rank and how, is that Red Blacks receiver group, because last season it was Chris Williams, then Ernest Jackson, then Greg Ellingson, and Brad Sinopoli as far as the targets go. And it's just seemed, we had talked about it, after the first week, the health of Ernest Jackson. It seems like he's not getting the targets that he had last season, and I don't know if it's matchups or I don't know if that injury continues to bug him. The previous week, Brad Sinopoli was the one that reaped the benefits. This week, it's Greg Ellingson. Who knows going forward? And that's where it's tough to predict. If you want to go with multiple Red Blacks receivers, you really do have to look at the matchups, and we'll get to that later on here. Perhaps this is the week that Ernest Jackson breaks out, but obviously, like I said here, Ellingson gets the big week 3.
Call it smug. I know you're a fan of more humility than anything, but when we were doing our Onside 2016 fantasy football guide, you had mentioned that Ernest Jackson may see a drop-off in his stats this year. So injuries is one thing potentially, but I'm just saying right now that Dan kind of called that. And a guy also to look at too is Khalil Payton. Still is coming back from injury. Jake Hardy is looking good too. So yeah, it's tough. As we get into matchups, we'll profile more of that. So Ernest Jackson, yeah, Dan kind of called that one. I just want to say. Dan's not really one to toot his own horn, so I'll toot it for him. Top value players of last week. Everybody loves a deal, right? Yeah, I know this guy. Chances are, if you live in Saskatchewan, he was pretty high owned. Darian Durant, pretty good value player, considering for the dollar amount that a lot of premier quarterbacks go for. He got you a pretty good point for a pretty nice price.
We've talked to some of the Americans that have got into CFL through watching their teams on DraftKings, and we had kind of said prior to the Toronto game, if the Riders start to put up points, you're going to really scratch your head at why there's so much overvalue of Rough Riders players. And we had to explain, when you do a year-long format in your fantasy, guys tend to overvalue the Rough Riders players. And obviously, Darian Durant, the dollar value worked out well. Guys that draft him at that $9,000 value, 33.18 points, he paid off for them. It's going to be fun watching it go forward. And another guy that's on the list here that we talked about already is Ricky Collins. Collins, another guy that sort of came out of nowhere to put up big numbers so far for the Rough Riders. Shamad Chambers had 16.3 points with only a $3,700 value. It's going to be something interesting to watch going forward as far as the ownership percentages. But for this week, 3 Rough Riders show up on our top value list.
And in the running backs, Anthony Allen, 4,500. Pretty low value for 24.9 points, a cheap option, and he produced the most running back points. And obviously, going forward, Jeremiah Johnson's health is going to depend on how many touches Anthony Allen gets. And Brandon Whitaker, a bit of a surprising performance. Don't jump through hoops and shoot for the moon thinking Brandon Whitaker each and every week is going to put that up. 2011, 2012, Brandon Whitaker was capable of that. Now, I don't think his knees can hold up a performance like that each and every week. So, but still, a good value if you did have him at 22.2 points for $5,600. And a lot of fans of Brandon Whitaker have been waiting for a breakout game from him. He's battled injuries for a long time in his career. And I have to say, as a guy who owns Brandon Whitaker in my long format fantasy, because I loaded heavy on receivers first, I was happy with the performance.
Yeah, he puts up over 22 points. And like we said in the opening, That injury of Mikael Brooks was the big one for the BC Lions. He plugs the middle of the field up for the BC Lions. And, Ricky Ray was able to depend on that. It opened up some of the passing game for him to get the ball into the hands of some of his playmakers. But as far as Brandon Whitaker goes, if you're considering putting him in your top 3 in the CFL as far as long season, we saw it in the Rough Riders game. He got a little bit banged up, and that's the one concern, is that an injury could take him down. You hope not, knock on wood, like you say, for your team's sake. But definitely Brandon Whitaker is somebody that I think, as far as the value goes, just be careful that you don't overvalue him.
And we did mention as well, with the game, the Riders and the Eskimos, Darrell Walker and Adarius Bowman were going to get a lot of targets. So somebody, we had figured Nate Kuhorn might have been one of the beneficiaries of some of those targets. He got him, dropped one in the end zone. But Corey Watson, his teammate, 21.8 points for $4,300. If you were a Corey Watson owner, you were smiling.
Yeah, a lot of targets Corey Watson's way, and he's sort of that inside receiver for the Eskimos, and it's going to be similar to Ottawa, where if the first 2 guys are covered, who's going to be the third one? And it could switch every week. We thought it was going to be Kuhorn based on the matchup that he was facing this week. Obviously, Corey Watson saw a lot of Otha Foster, who's a very good coverage guy as a Sam linebacker, but he was able to get some plays, get some blocks, and get upfield.
Another player that you may, by seeing his name, have already fallen in love with him. And maybe, if you're not overly familiar with the CFL game, you might be calling this guy a sleeper of the year. But Jace Davis for the Bombers, $4,000 last week at 15.4 points so far, has been a pretty respectable investment. But we would have to say, to go along with that he's always open. So along with that may change in the future the fortunes for Jace Davis.
Well, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, the one thing that you have to look at, and it's no different than the NFL, is targets based on how much we're paying you. And the Winnipeg Blue Bombers went out and spent a pile of money on Weston Dressler and Ryan Smith. And they're going to feed those guys a lot, give them a lot of targets. And we had said it in last week's podcast that Jace Davis was a little bit of a beneficiary of the injury to Weston Dressler. And then Dressler, who's going to appear on our next list, the biggest disappointments of the week, didn't get the same amount of targets that we thought he would. We thought he was going to be in that top 10 for receivers last week, and it could be just as he comes back, but also one that I'm starting to believe more and more as we go forward. Quentin Pointer really impressed me for the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Sorry. I saw that more as the matchup doing it than anything. You're going to see Weston Dressler, as this week goes or season goes on, get back to that week 1 where he is just getting fed like crazy by Drew Willie, and that's going to allow that Winnipeg offense to take off. Jace Davis is just a little bit more of a check down guy. Dressler and Smith and Darvin Adams are going to be the top 3 to watch for still.
Anthony Parker and the Stamps as well, 12.7 points last week at $3,400, and he's not a guy week in and week out that's going to see a lot of targets. Same draft year, picture him a little bit like Nate Kuhorn, who's going to see 4 or 5 balls a week, somewhere in between 30 and 60 yards on average. The Bombers defense gave us a bit of a surprise last week as well. $4,400, 13 points, over 300 yards against, but 5 turnovers. That was the big difference against the Ticats. Easily one of the biggest surprises of the week too. And probably the biggest surprise of the week on defense, have to say, the Rich Stubler defense in Toronto. $4,700, 13 points on DraftKings. We saw the other side of that on that game being the beneficiary of the big points.
Well, speaking of on the other side, we've talked about the Calgary Stampeders and what they've lost this past offseason, losing Keon Raymond. You're seeing the Keon Raymond effect already in Toronto. He's really getting that group going. You can see he's sort of the inspirational leader of that group, and last week he gets a big interception for the Argonauts. He's going to be someone that continues to lead them going forward, and you've talked about a couple studs in that Argonaut defense and Isaiah Green. They've signed Devin Smith back, who was with the team last year and retired in the offseason. He's coming back to Toronto. Akwasi Owusu-Ansah, one of the top cornerbacks on the field side. AJ Jefferson could still come back. This Argonauts defense could be one to watch for going forward, but really, it really is something to see Rich Stubler and his I guess, top student from his days in the Calgary Stampeders, and Keon Raymond being the biggest ones that push them up.
I have some comments on Akwasi Owusu-Ansah, which we'll get to when we get to the matchups, but boy, that guy's impressed me. Not on the stats side. Biggest disappointments of the week. Owusu-Ansah can be in there, but he's not featured because we're talking about DraftKings points, and that's Drew Willie. Led the charge, only 14.36 points last week at $9,400 value, and we had this guy ranked pretty high coming into the season.
Yeah, and it's something to see. Again, this was a tough Hamilton defense. You know, Drew Willie in the Calgary game had a bit of breakout with as far as garbage points. The garbage points weren't there this week in spite of a spirited performance by the Bombers' defense and special teams. It's going to be another one where it's tough to predict as far as Drew Willie goes. This week, they obviously get the Edmonton Eskimos, who have been susceptible to big plays through the air, so watch for that. Drew Willie could have a bounce-back week, but if he isn't able to, who knows? Bombers fans have been calling for Drew Willie to get knocked down and given Matt Nichols an opportunity behind center. If Willie continues to struggle, who knows what Mike O'Shea, as he struggles to keep his job, what he may do.
Len, like we said about Drew Willie in the 2016 Fantasy Guide, if this isn't going to be the year that he gets it done, Bombers likely look elsewhere in the offseason. That 1990 drought, that's the last time they won a championship in a 9 or 8 team league. That's almost ridiculous. Jonathan Jennings for BC last week. Bit of a surprise there. We had some pretty high expectations for the sophomore. 11.08 points, pardon me, at $7,800 value. And a former MOP came in and looked pretty good in a replacement.
Yeah, after the interception to Keon Raymond, Travis Lulay came in on the very next series, and he did. He moved the ball around the field, got lots of people involved in the offense. Obviously, Anthony Allen with his ground game supporting it. Lulay did look pretty good. It's going to be something to watch for this week. I think that Wally Botto has shown how short of a leash he's going to have on Jonathan Jennings. He possibly may go back to Jennings, but in case of Lulay, a lot of questions were about his arm strength, Dave, and I know that you had those questions in the offseason as we were making up our rankings of how do you sort of value Travis Lulay. Is his arm and shoulder completely gone? He looked pretty decent as far as throwing some pretty deep balls and outs. If the Lions continue to struggle with Jonathan Jennings, it could be Lulay the rest of the way.
TSN did a great piece last year on how Travis Lulay actually dropped the trajectory of the way he tosses a ball in order to accommodate his shoulder and the surgery that he did have there. So strength is back. That's what they were saying. Chris Cuthbert was talking a lot about that on the broadcast last week. So, hey, as we mentioned last year and coming into this season as well, we're big fans of Travis Lulay. We love to see him succeed and have success again in the league long term. But Jonathan Jennings is the future of that team. So I would hedge my bets. I would be as far as saying that I would guess Jonathan Jennings gets one more shot at it this week. A guy we expected last week because of his performance in the prior week to have a good game. Call it a product and maybe against a really stifling run defense. But Torrey Harrison at $4,600, negative 0.1 points. And some owners maybe experienced a bit of that bite.
Yeah, and that's one where, there is the value there. And you talk about types of players that you could use in a flex spot. It seemed like in that Week 2 game against Winnipeg, Torrey Harrison came in and vultured a touchdown from Jerome Messam. The thought would be, especially in a matchup against a team like the Ottawa Redblacks, where there were going to be a pile of points on the board, Bo Levi Mitchell was going to be using his running backs as far as pass catchers a little bit more, which points to Torrey Harrison. Harrison just struggled as the game went on, and Jerome Messam was able to get some catches through the air, but the Stampeders didn't really get either involved. Messam was sort of middle of the pack as far as running backs go, which didn't surprise me either, but I felt like if Torrey Harrison was given the opportunity, he could have added some points. He didn't. One of our biggest disappointments of this week, and a question mark as the Stampeders go into the bye week.
One of our biggest ones, because the biggest one is coming up very, very shortly. This one, we never really have high hopes for. If he gets into the lineup, he gets into the lineup. He's maybe a little bit overvalued even in long format and in DFS, and that's Shaquille Murray-Lawrence. The BC Lions, $2,700. A big fat donut, a Cheerio, last week. Not even a single yard, not even 10 yards, nothing. Shaquille Murray-Lawrence, a national running back, which is mainly why he does get a lot of touches in that same category as your Matt Walter and that kind of thing. So we wouldn't really call him a disappointment for our sakes, but maybe you, if you did value him a little higher, fairly disappointing is Shaquille Murray-Lawrence.
Yeah, he had that $2,700 value, and a lot of people are really hyping him as the week went on. Here's a perfect flex option. He's going to get some timeshare in the BC backfield. But as far as it goes, like you say, he's a Canadian backup. He's similar to Anthony Woodson in Hamilton, Matt Walter in Saskatchewan. There's a lot of teams. Keaton LaFrance is another one in Ottawa. Guys that you look at, they're number 2 on the depth chart. You think, okay, well, he's going to get some opportunity in there, but in this case, it's a perfect example. The BC Lions ran Anthony Allen the entire way. Anthony Allen's a veteran running back. They didn't need to spell him at any point during the game, and as a result, Shaquille Murray-Lawrence puts up 0 points.
If you're new to CFL fantasy football or Canadian football in general, you'll know a few things about me. I like to make bold claims. Sometimes they come true. A lot of times they come true, actually. And I get soapbox players. Guys that I think that should really step up and get to perform. When they do, they really reach their all-time high. And guys that I wonder, why are they still in the CFL? Well, see, Dan the stats guy, Dan's the smart guy, I'm the mouthpiece. So Dan and I talked, we're like, you know what? Because of the matchup, CJ Gable this week, I think, actually, he might have a pretty good game. But CJ Gable probably heard that I've been picking on that guy for a number of years. And boy, was he a disappointment this week.
Yeah, only puts up just over 5 points. And in our notes there, I just have one word, sigh. Because CJ Gable, we had talked, like you'd said, we had talked about the matchup. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers, who have been the weakest defense against the run, it seemed like it was going to be a breakout game. Perhaps CJ Gable would get a red zone touch and perhaps get a touchdown. It was the same as he's done all year long, doesn't get many looks, and I know that you're thinking possibly it might be because CJ Gable. We had also talked in the offseason with the changeover in offensive coordinators. Tommy Condell left the Ticats. Stefan Potasic, the former head coach of the McMaster Marauders, comes on board. We thought, okay, well maybe the Tiger Cats will go away from being so pass dependent on offense, and maybe the running backs will get an opportunity. We realize now that that's just Kent Austin. Kent Austin does not want to run the ball. He has no interest in running the ball. He'll never run the ball. CJ Gable's never going to be a big point producer in fantasy, and that's not to say because of his talent, because CJ Gable can be a very big talent. You've seen that in past years in the CFL, but he's a product of a terrible system for a running back.
CJ Gable flat out used to hurdle guys. You can look up highlights of his over years past. He's got talent. I can definitely align with that. A guy who does have talent, which we didn't expect to actually have a very good week. If you look at our DraftKings rankings, the DFS rankings for last week is 1A, 1B in Edmonton. Darius Bowman brought it home, but Mr. Walker, only 10.8 in a $9,900 value.
Yeah, not many targets then for what Walker is used to in the Edmonton offense. He was sort of overlooked. He had Buddy Jackson, a veteran cornerback, in coverage on him and pretty much put a blanket over top of him. He had one in the end zone that was intercepted that he was able to get in a mismatch with opposite corner Justin Cox, but the pass fell short of him. So Darrell Walker, an off week for him, especially at that $9,900 value. He'll bounce back. Don't sleep on Darrell Walker this week.
A guy that we really highly touted this week, as we did allude to, probably our biggest disappointment when it comes for rankings for last week was Weston Dressler, $7,500, only 7.6 points, and Dan already alluded to before, Quinton Pointer looked like he had him covered pretty well.
Yeah, and Dressler comes back from the concussion. Who knows? Maybe it was just one where he needed to get some of the rust off after missing a week, but Dressler, again, this isn't a guy that you're going to want to ignore. $7,500 value is a good value for him. He could be, in certain weeks, the top receiver in the league, just based purely off of his talent.
Ernest has gone to camp. Ernest has gone to the end zone. Ernest went to the disappointment category this week for the Red Blacks. 6.9 points at $7,400, and we alluded to before quite a bit already that maybe a hampering injury could possibly be. Could be a product of different targets. Trevor Harris, a different relationship with receivers. All those things factor in. Where last year, you saw a lot of Henry Burris slinging it to Jackson and to Brad Sinopoli, where two of his top guys, where Harris right now looks to be favoring Ellingson and Williams quite a bit. So all that saying, going forward, maybe be a little bit cautious on Ernest Jackson, as he was one of our big disappointments last week.
Week 8 and Week 9 are the big ones to watch for. The Red Blacks don't go on to bye until Week 8. There's a possibility that, maybe there is a nagging injury, and so, temper your expectations a little bit with Ernest Jackson until the Red Blacks get to the bye week. Like you say, with the chemistry that he has with the quarterback, perhaps Henry Burris comes back based on what Rick Campbell wants to do with his offense. It's going to be interesting to watch. That's going to be a fun bye week and following week to see what the Ottawa Red Blacks offense looks like.
A guy that if you've owned him already, you've had some fun. Vidal Hazelton, Toronto, 9.1 points, $7,600. And we didn't really expect a lot of Hazelton coming into that matchup against the BC Lions.
Yeah, Ronnie Yell, the elite corner for the BC Lions. We were texting back and forth today. It seems almost like what are receivers going to when they line up against Ronnie Yell, Dave?
Yell hell.
Just not the type of guy that you want to start your receiver against. Ronnie Yell has been someone, and one of the stats that I was really interested in seeing, quarterbacks that have thrown his way, only 50% on as far as their completion rate on passes to Ronnie Yell. We'll talk about the matchup the Yell has this week on someone that maybe you need to be down on.
We'll get into social media very shortly here, but something we're a fan of is interactions with players on Twitter. We got a lot of them that do follow our podcast. Nick Grigsby is one of them. Gave us a few retweets on the weekend. Ronnie Yell is a guy that's very active on Twitter. So if someone can get the Yell hell trending, I know that Randall's Land is one in Winnipeg, and that'd be a fun one there. The Eskimos defense and the Lions defense. Yeah, both big disappointments on the weekend at $2 a piece, 2 points, 5,600 and 5,000 respectively. And getting into the matchups very shortly, we'll expect a little bit better from the Lions, but not much better from the Eskimos, possibly this week. Who knows? Just teasing you. Stay tuned. We'll see what comes down the pipe. Boys, a busy week on social media. As always, we talked about that huge interaction between that one fantasy league, which was hilarious. We'll get to that very shortly. Will also be the debut, by the way, of producer Dan and engineer Ben on the podcast. Excited about that. But first, why don't Dan and I fire through some of the questions that we got. First, Nick Andolina had another winner on DFS and gave us a bit of a shout out on Twitter for that. And his team looked pretty good. Riley White, Ricky Collins, Jace Davis, Darius, Chris Williams, and the lone spot that didn't work for him was the Lions defense. So thanks for the shout out there, Nick. Marco Frias at Portuguese Baron, Dan asked us, any word if Lule is running the offense this week? And so far today, Dan and I are kind of up in the air. The Lions haven't practiced yet.
Well, and there's a little bit from Lowell Ulrich of 3 Down Nation. He expects Jennings to get the start next week, but nothing official from the Lions. That's just rumor right now as far as Jennings getting back behind center. But like we said, Jennings will be on a short leash if he doesn't succeed against what could be a very tough Rough Riders defense. We'll get to that also in the matchups. But if Lule does get to practice, I could see this. Right now I'm a little bit higher on Lule. I know a lot of people that are Lions fans are also clamoring for Lule to get behind center. It's going to be an interesting one to watch this week, so keep an eye on our Twitter account for updates on that one.
Thanks for the question, Marco. Long-time follower as well. We appreciate that. Matt Swanson, new to the CFL, or the following our account this year, so we appreciate the interactions with you. Matt, he asked us, what are the rules for the 6-game IR? Well, Matt, different than the 9-game. There was a cap on how many guys you could pull off the 9-game last year. This year, 6 games, fair game.
Yeah, well, actually,
3 years ago.
3 years ago, the CFL signed a new CBA agreement in 2014, and took away the 9-game injured list. They now have a 1-game injured list and a 6-game injured list. And we went back and forth with Dave Campbell, color commentator for the Edmonton Eskimos, about this. I'm still convinced on this that it is a situation that when the CBA was first signed, I don't know if it's changed in the time since, but the way I understand it, and Monday was a prime example, Zach Collaros, the star quarterback for the Hamilton Tiger Cats, the Ticats activated him from the 6-game IR. He's only missed, I guess it would be 3 games for the Ticats. It's going to be one where the Ticats are allowed one more player that they can bring off the 6-game early without any kind of salary cap repercussions. So you're given 2 freebies, and the way the 6-game IR works is that the player's salary does not count towards the salary cap while they're on the 6-game IR. So in the case of this, they don't have to go back and pay Travis Lulay's previous games for being on the 6-game IR. They've got another freebie, but once they do that, those guys have to stay on the 6-game IR. Otherwise, they'll have to pay them for those games that are missed. And the biggest reason for that is teams were using that sort of to hide guys from other teams rather than putting them on the practice roster and allowing them to be signed by other teams off that practice roster, even though there's a bit of a gentleman's agreement. What this allows is for the teams to, I guess, not just lose the guy for half a season, and it was brought in with the new CBA. So I believe that's the case. Hopefully, Dave, if Dave's listening, he can get back to us on that. But the way that I understand it is you're given 2 freebies as far as the salary cap goes.
I'm listening. What are you talking about? I know you're talking about Dave Campbell. I'm just kidding. But there, yeah, no, we're not saying. Does that happen? Players get hidden on the IR? No. That's never happened before. That potentially. I could name some names, but I'm not. Nope. My favorite, possibly my favorite Twitter name, the account that does follow us, Snot and Balls. Selly_ILL27. Thank you. I'm not sure what that alludes to, but that's part of your question. I'd like to know a little more about possible Montreal tendencies with Cato and some information on Chandler Jones. We already covered that earlier on in the podcast, but expect the Alouettes to be much more active when it comes to the quarterback. If Cato's going to be at the controls, a lot more rollouts, airing it down the field a little more. Kevin Glenn tends to lean on more high percentage throws, and he likes to throw an interception when the game's on the line. I'm just going to throw that in there too. John Mason 777. John, big shout out to you. Thanks so much for following us and listening to us for so many years. There was a conversation we had back and forth for a little while, and he threw that on the end. Would you grab BJ Cunningham over Ricky Collins or Naaman Roosevelt? Good question.
It really depends on the format. If it's a keeper league, I think with SJ Green's injury, there's a possibility that could be career-ending for him. So that brings BJ Cunningham's, projection for his career, moves him up a little bit. As far as Ricky Collins or Naaman Roosevelt, we kind of debated this amongst ourselves prior to going on air, Dave. And the thing that I said to you is that it really comes down to positioning again. And Naaman Roosevelt plays that weak side receiver position, and he's going to get the targets. I think in the case of Ricky Collins, it could be inconsistent targets. He's had decent targets through the first 2 games of the season. Putting them head-to-head, Roosevelt versus Cunningham, I still am going to stick with Roosevelt. He's going to be over 1,000 yards this year for the Rough Riders. I think Cunningham will have good weeks for the Alouettes, but that Alouette offense, and we've talked about it on past podcasts, even with Deron Carter remaining on there, it's still going to have really, really bad games where Kevin Glenn or Rakeem Cato or Brandon Bridge or Vernon Adams or the guy that packs my groceries this morning.
Or your Aunt in Windsor. Don't forget your Aunt in Windsor from Week 1 podcast.
Your Aunt in Windsor, whoever Jim Poff decides to sign and play at quarterback, it's going to be a work in progress this year. It's a tough group to predict, and you want stability. I think Naaman Roosevelt is the most stable one. You could maybe roll the dice a little bit with BJ Cunningham, and I know you're very high on Ricky Collins, Dave. Maybe I'm completely out to lunch, and you think Collins should be the top one in those 3.
Well, another reason that Collins got cut by the Bombers in favor of Jace Davis or in favor of Thomas Mayo. So either way you look at it, Ricky Collins, he targets going forward, I think he's got game breaker potential, but Naaman Roosevelt is going to be one that will likely get the most consistent targets and a safe spot going forward. All right. In podcasts in the past, you've heard us talk a lot about, and including this one, producer Dan and engineer Ben. So, like we said off the top of the show, there was a hilarious interaction on our Twitter between some guys in a fantasy league that Dan and I quite enjoyed. So, without further ado, we're going to have these two fine gentlemen reenact the conversation of these men, and we do hope you enjoy it. Guys, take it away.
I'm Rick James, bitch. Bring it, Sleddy and the Jets. Hashtag Jets are gonna crash. Hashtag like Golden State Warriors. Hashtag Top Gun. Hashtag views from the ground. Sit down, both of you. My rearview mirror is full of you. Hashtag TNT Tornadoes. Hashtag 3-time champ. Hashtag on top again.
Enjoy the view, because objects in the mirror are closer than they appear.
Oh, Chip, I see you. Go low on bowling. The elderly are waiting. And that is coming from Sleddy and the Jets. Competing more like Sleddy and the Cessna.
Uh-oh. This is about to get real.
Calm down, Mr. Venn. 2 of my 3 championship rings are covering my eyes. I can't see what you are saying.
That was good.
What you actually don't know about Engineer Ben is that's who he actually really sounds in real life.
Yeah, no differences to his voice from usual, or from producer Dan. I think his time spent trying to put up a second accent for that. That's what made it priceless for me.
The French one, I think he was going with the Patrick Waugh because that was kind of a Patrick Waugh hybrid quote there. So thanks a lot to Charlie Taylor, Jeremy Venn, and Colin Sletton for that interaction. And we love chatting with people on Twitter. We get direct messages all week long, almost 24 hours a day. It seems Dan and I are glued to our phones replying, and we love that engagement. Dan, our winner has to go to...
We're going to go with Jeremy because you know what? Jeremy actually put money down on our fantasy rankings on a weekly basis. So we're going to have to go with him because he paid us.
So there you go. If you want to win anything, you pay it off. That's how you do it. You give us money and you win. Plain and simple as that. To go along with that, yeah, you can get your DFS rankings. You can win big cash each and every week when playing DFS or playing long format. How do you do that? Well, you can pick up some guys on the wire. And there's a couple guys probably hanging on your free agent wires right now that you might want to grab onto. One of them being Travis Lulay of the Lions. As we'd mentioned earlier,
go ahead, Dave. I was just going to say, as far as with Lulay, you know, if he's going to be the starter, it's going to be somebody that's going to be a safe play.
As we mentioned earlier, yeah, 12 of 15 last week, $156 for a TD and a pick. And Travis Lulay is usually good at protecting the ball, too. And James Franklin of the Eskimos, now that Thomas DeMarco was released over the weekend, Jay Frank is going to be the backup at number 2 once again. And if Mike Riley goes down, which we have seen in weeks past, Franklin could step right in. Moving down to the running back category, Brandon Rutley is in for Tyrell Sutton. And oh boy, do we have high hopes for this guy coming into the season. And Brandon Rutley, if he's still on your waiver wire right now or again in DFS situation, Brandon Rutley's a guy you could plug in. He catches well out of the backfield. He's got a great first step. He can make guys miss, as can Nick Grigsby or Moses Madu in Ottawa. Grigsby, not as much catching out of the backfield, but he won the starting job over Madu. But going forward, possibly could be on a short leash.
Yeah, this is going to be one to watch for this week. Obviously, Grigsby did have a decent enough game, but he had a late game fumble that Rick Campbell is not going to love. The Red Blacks were on the 1 yard line, gets the carry, fumbles at the goal line, turns it over, and it would have given the Red Blacks the win. If he's given another chance, obviously Grigsby run with, but make sure you keep an eye out for Madu if you're in a situation that you're really, really desperate. Perhaps Madu is someone that you could add and hope that Grigsby comes up short again and Madu jumps in there. But for now, it will continue to be Grigsby.
especially like our long format league. There's 8 teams, and each team's got 3 running backs. So there's a lot of guys that don't see carries that are on your roster. The wide receivers, Ricky Collins, if he's still on your free agent wire, grab him. 6 catches, $115, and a TD, which, if you listened to us last week, we kind of told you so.
We said on this waiver wire ad list that Ricky Collins was a guy that you should be targeting. If you didn't get him, maybe slap yourself in the side of the head and listen for the other names that maybe we can help you with this week.
Like BJ Cunningham of the Alouettes, that we had already talked about his talent with SJ Green and Carter potentially suspended. He's going to see some big targets this weekend. Chandler Jones, Corbin Laux, and Alex Charette, all other potential options in the Montreal receiving core. On the defensive line, if you're in long format fantasy, Adrian Hubbard is one we talked about at length, a sack and a fumble recovery, and Drake Nevis. Oh boy, has he ever come on strong, and he looked good again last week on the Hamilton interior.
Yeah, he's going to be a week-to-week start for the Hamilton Tiger Cats in the middle of the defensive line right next to Ted Laurent. That's going to be a strong group as the Hamilton front 7 can be potentially very dominant. We saw it in week 1 with Simone Lawrence's big day. Drake Nevis could be somebody that gets you decent enough stats if you're in a deep league that you need defensive linemen.
Ken Bishop, Toronto, 4 tackles and a sack last week. Jonathan Newsom, defensive end, who is the reason why Sean Lemon is now in Toronto, 4 tackles. And the thing that really impresses me about Newsom is his speed and how he's able to be used kind of off of the line of scrimmage and be able to give Chris Jones some offense or some options, defensively. And Newsom, if he's on the wire, you might want to grab a hold of him.
Yeah, and then the other one in Saskatchewan, we talked earlier in the podcast about Cedric McKinley, who will be the new starting defensive tackle in Chris Jones' defense. He's going to be a difference maker as he already knows this defense before he even shows up in Regina.
Couple of Calgary Stampeders, one we've talked about in weeks past already. Tommy Campbell last week, 6 tackles and a pick. Stamps are on bye week, so keep that in mind going forward. And Alex Singleton, which we had a question about already earlier with Taylor Reed and Deron Mayo. Now, word on how long they're going to be out for, but Alex Singleton and the linebacking core might be one you want to have your finger on.
Yeah, 6 tackles from Singleton last week. It could be one, it could be both, but Singleton will be the one that's the first up. Now that Glenn Love, also a backup in Calgary, goes on the 6-game IR, Singleton's next man up.
All right, rounding out the defensive backs, Matt Black, talked about him last week, in for Jermaine Gabriel. Aaron Barry, 6 tackles, each of those fine gentlemen last week. And one we talked about, Lucius Purifoy. Oh boy, I love saying that guy's name. BC Lions beat out Stephen Clark, 3 tackles and a sack last week.
Yeah, he's going to be continue to be around the line of scrimmage for the BC Lions in the Mark Washington defense in Vancouver. Purifoy is a playmaker. He's going to be in coverage against some of the top players in the league. Think of somebody like a Keon Raymond as a potential for this guy going forward.
All right, those are your waiver wire ads. Now rounding it all out, looking ahead to this week. Calgary Stampeders are on bye. What I love about this week, I love watching 6 hours of football, Thursday, Friday. The last 2 weeks have been great. But one thing I do miss is come time for Saturday morning, I'm like, football's over for the weekend. This week, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. That's fantastic. Every day, you got something to look forward to in life. So Wednesday, Ottawa and Toronto, 7:30 Eastern. And right away, when looking at the matchup, Trevor Harris comes back, his first game against his old team. And Chris Williams, how's he going to do?
Well, Chris Williams, it's been one that we've talked about already, whether or not he's going to continue his string. You could see the Argos throw all 12 guys in the field against him. Maybe the coaching staff runs in the field, maybe another 25 fans run in the field as well as try to cover him. He'll probably still get open. He'll still be wide open somehow and weave his way through all 50-plus people in the field. Williams is someone that you can continue to start this week. He's probably going to see a lot of Aaron Barry, the Argos, rookie DB who spent a lot of time in the NFL. And so I wouldn't necessarily call him a rookie, but they've generally left Owusu-Ansah on the strong side of the field and left either TJ Heath or Aaron Barry on the weak side of the field. That'll be Chris Williams' side. 2 weeks ago, remember Naaman Roosevelt's production, 9 catches, 113 yards from that exact receiver spot. You could see Williams with another 100-plus yard game.
Akwasi Owusu-Ansah has emerged himself to be a pretty good defensive player. I'm just going to leave that out and say that. Points-wise, if you're in long format fantasy, he's kind of one of those guys that he's going to be shutting things down a little bit. Guy who's got shut down, we talked about it earlier, Ernest Jackson. His numbers have gone down. He'll be matched up against Josh Mitchell. We'll see if maybe that'll give him an opportunity to put up points.
Yeah, the possibility is Mitchell, and if he can't go, obviously Devin Smith, who spent time in this defense last season, could possibly move in there. Just with the question mark, I really like Jackson this week. He could, if he is healthy, be back into the elite receiver numbers for the Red Blacks.
And a guy that I make my bold predictions on Twitter, that I put one today, that Isaiah Green could potentially be one of the shutdown players by the end of the year. Brian Burnham only had 17 yards last week, matched up against Isaiah Green, and Greg Ellingson, who had a big week last week, is going toe-to-toe with the rookie DB. So that could be a tough matchup for Mr. Ellingson, and if he can shut Ellingson down this week, he will be turning some heads, will he not?
Yeah, well, and that's why I kind of like Jackson's matchup a little bit more. You've got Ellingson against Green. You've got Brad Sinopoli. He's going to see a lot of Keon Raymond. And we know what Keon Raymond, big play Ray, what he can do in that Argos defense. So you could see them shy away from those guys. Owusu-Ansah is a great cover guy. He'll be seeing Jake Hardy. So from that Argonauts defensive perspective, I see the Red Blacks going back to their big two from last year, and possibility for big games from them. On to the rushing game for the Red Blacks, whether it is Nick Grigsby or Moses Madu. Think back last week, Anthony Allen had 107 yards on the ground, plus 32 receiving yards, plus the touchdown. He had a big day. Grigsby looked decent enough for the Red Blacks last week. He could be continued as a good play as far as running back goes.
On the Toronto side of the ball, Ricky Ray is going to be matched up against an Ottawa defense that can be susceptible to some big plays through the air. So, potentially, keep an eye on that one. Vidal Hazelton's going to be matched up against Jonathan Rose on the weak side receiver spot. Week 1, Darrell Walker at 149 yards. Week 2, Deron Carter on pace for over 100. Week 3, Joe West had 99. So, you know what that means. Vidal Hazelton could be a guy you could look at this week. And Torrey Gurley against Forrest Hightower if he's healthy. If not, it'll be Brandon Sermons.
Yeah, they've already said that Hightower's out, so it will be Brandon Sermons that gets the start in that spot. He's not a rookie by any means, but there is a possibility that if the Argos try to go deep, they get to meet up with one of my favorite players in the league, the freight train in my mind, Jermaine Robinson at the free safety spot, Dave.
Yeah, and Deron Carter knows all about that collision. And Jermaine Robinson, pretty well known right now for a play that he's not very happy about. One that sent the game into overtime last week, but don't let his name attach to that. He's a fantastic football player. Kenny Shaw is going to be matched up against Jarrell Gavins, although could be Abdul Kanay. Either way, both pretty fantastic defensive backs. We really don't like the matchup if it is against Kanay. Gavins will be matched up against Wallace Miles. Either way, both of those guys, we figure Kenny Shaw's stock's going to go down as Deontay Spencer gets more and more healthy in coming weeks. And boy, we cannot wait for that guy to get healthy again.
Yeah, that's going to be one. Once we get to week 6 and week 7, we're really going to be pushing for you to get him as a starter in your matchup and in your league, because Deontay Spencer could be something special this year.
Antoine Prideaux's probably going to be either against Anthony Coombs or Andre Dury, and Anthony Coombs hasn't seen the production we'd hope. Neither will Andre Dury, a guy that going forward we would just say altogether probably avoid. Outside of the receiving touchdown last week, Calgary running backs were pretty relatively ineffective against the Red Blacks, so Brandon Whitaker did have a big day on the ground, but don't expect big performances in the rushing game against the Red Blacks defense. Moving into Thursday night, Bombers and Eskimos potentially could be a shootout, could be a gunsling festival. Teams have put up big numbers against the Eskimos, and Mike Riley against that Bombers defense, especially, Dan, if one guy down the middle is banged up.
Yeah, we've talked about the injury to Khalil Bass. If he is even just a little bit banged up, you could see Mike Riley drop down and take the ball and try to get some yards himself. He's in past seasons been one of the top rushing quarterbacks in the CFL. This could be a breakout game for him, as the Bombers are likely to throw double teams on Darrell Walker and Adarius Bowman and try to get them covered.
Yeah, between Johnny Adams, Kevin Fogg is going to be... Johnny Adams will potentially take that spot back if he's going to be healthy. Darius Bowman could be matched up against Julian Posey, or CJ Roberts could be a very beneficial matchup. And Julian Posey is asserting himself as a pretty respectable defensive back, or Bruce Johnson if he's healthy in the lineup. Again, Chris Getzlaff, could he get Posey, Roberts, or Hawkins? Beneficial for him. Owens had 92 last week in the same spot. Marquea $1.16 the week before. Stafford 67, a favorable matchup. Nate Kuhorn is going to get Chris Randall. That's not a very favorable one for the Medicine Hat native. And Corey Watson is going to see Mo Leggett. We saw what Mo did last week.
Yeah, takes the pick six for the Bombers to the house, and he's been known as a ball hawk his entire CFL career. Don't expect a repeat performance from Corey Watson in the Manitoba Capital on Thursday night against his former team, also to mention that.
Yeah, not to forget about that. John White, one of his many former teams, I suppose. John White, I guess only two other former teams. Anyway, John White, he's going to likely run all over the Bombers' defense, so if you have him, start him and have him high in DFS. Drew Willie, garbage time, if he can get it going from the beginning, could put some success together. The Eskimos are weak, in that strong side slot back position, as well as overall through the air. And if he does get matched up against Weston or Pat Watkins, Dressler could have some success.
Yeah, the one I looked at with that one is, you look at week one, Chris Williams, a little bit more of a shifty receiver than the receivers the Eskimos faced in other weeks. So you could see similar production as what Chris Williams had in week one from Weston Dressler.
Ryan Smith will get Marcel Young, who's back and healthy, practiced today. And John Childs did very little at that spot last week. Darvin Adams against Cord Parks. That's a tough one for Darvin Adams, even though he's the leading receiver for Winnipeg right now. Not a favorable one. Jace Davis will get Kenny Ladler again. The rookie, boy, does he look good this year. And Rory Collard will get matched up against Watkins or Ballou. And Collard doesn't really get a whole lot of targets despite his passport.
Yeah, he's a little bit more of a decoy in Paul LaPolice's offense so far this season. So it's hard to be high on him because of that for this game against Edmonton.
Andrew Harris will be another big one at running back this week. Moving into Friday's game, Hamilton and Montreal. Jeremiah Mazzoli, now that Zach Collaros is off of the 6th game, he's got to protect the ball. 5 turnovers last week against a very, very tough Alouettes defense at home. We do not like that matchup. We will say that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing you're going to see from the Hamilton Tiger Cats is a little bit more of a conservative offense. Masoli in those first 3 games has slung the ball out a little bit more than I think the Ticats want to. I think they're going to see him as a little bit more of a game manager in these games until Zach Collaros comes back. So he's going to have a lot more. We've talked about the comparison, but have a lot more of a look like a Kevin Glenn, where it is a little bit more conservative and tries to get underneath plays instead of slinging the ball deep.
When he does sling, he'll look at Chad Owens, but Owens is going to get Billy Parker, so that's not going to produce a lot of offense there. Andy Fantus will get Chip Cox. 2 old dudes battling it out over the middle. I love Dan's notes here. 82 yards to Jace Davis. Brad Sinopoli had a $105 in week 2, but since Mazzoli's going to try and protect the ball, Fantus could probably see a few more targets than usual. And Tasker is going to get Javon Johnson. Oh boy. And Javon, friend of the show, does follow us as well. We don't look at that as a favorable matchup.
Yeah, Ryan Smith in week 1 saw very little. Ernest Jackson did very little in week 2. So Javon Johnson, as he shifts from his typical cornerback position into the halfback role for the Ticats, he'll latch on to Luke Tasker, and it's not a favorable matchup. You look at those 3 slot backs; they are the main guys in Hamilton. Obviously we've talked about it in past weeks. Chad Owens and Jeremiah Masoli, they're both from Hawaii. They train together in the off season. They've known each other for a long, long, long time. Owens is Masoli's favorite target, so he may try to force it in there a little bit to him. It may not work, and that Billy Parker matchup, So that's a very tough one to really go with, but Andy Fantu seems like the safe one, as he can get a little bit more of the safer type catches. The last two in that receiver group for Hamilton, Taekwon Underwood against Jonathan Mincy. Because he's going to be protecting the ball, don't look for him to go deep to Underwood, and that's generally his role with the Ticats offense since he's arrived in Hamilton. And then the last one, Spencer Watt, who really hasn't seen a whole lot from Jeremiah Masoli from that strong side receiver spot. He'll continue to get very little this week.
And Taekwon Underwood was out catching balls until midnight last week after that last game and his big drop that he had in the end zone. And if he continues to struggle going forward, they might make complete change and take Taekwon Underwood out of the lineup. So I'd avoid him this week. We talked about CJ Gable already. They don't run the ball. And looking at quarterback for the Montreal Alouettes, Kevin Glenn may actually still be under center potentially just because of his eye discomfort he had on Monday. They will make a decision whether or not it will be Glenn or Cato. So keep an eye on who that potentially could be between the two. And if Duron Carter's suspension is the appeal is still in waiting, then he may be able to play this week too. He'll be matched up against Quinton Pointer, which could be a tough one for him as well. All right, we'll just rip through a few of these last ones here. BJ Cunningham will go against Johnny Sears. That's a tough one for him. Nick Lewis gets Rico Murray if he's healthy. Sam Jaguar against Travis Lee. Sam Jaguar, for the most part, is just a decoy. Don't value him very high. We've said it in podcasts over the years. Sam Jaguar is a guy that you can pretty much just sleep on. Chandler Jones, Emmanuel Davis. That's going to be a tough matchup. And Brandon Rutley, oh boy, are they going to be ditching it to him? You're going to love to see Brandon Rutley. Last but not least.
And actually, I'm just going to jump in there, Dave, just so that guys don't just immediately say it's going to be Chandler Jones. Watch for the depth chart, whether it is Chandler Jones or Corbin Laux or Alex Charette before making any decision on that. But again, it's going to be a rookie against one of the best cornerback or cover guys in the league at the halfback spot for Hamilton in Emmanuel Davis.
Google him, YouTube him. If you haven't seen Emmanuel Davis, you don't know who he is and what he can do. Last but not least, the final game of the weekend, the Riders at home on Saturday night against the Lions. We've talked about Luley or Jennings, whichever one it's going to be already. Emmanuel Davis against Ed Gainey. Ed Gainey hasn't looked very good this year, and the Riders may go away from him in coming weeks if he continues to struggle. And this week, he gets Emmanuel Arsenault. That's a tough task.
Yeah, last week, Adarius Bowman got plenty of points against Ed Gainey. It could just be one where Gainey's trying to figure out his way in Chris Jones's defense. He's a veteran cover guy, but against Arsenault, one of the premier receivers in the CFL, I really do like the matchup for the BC slot back.
Nick Moore is going to get a lot of Otha Foster. Corey Watson did pretty favorably last week, so Moore could have a good game. Sean Gore is going to get Buddy Jackson, and Gore, we've said how people have overvalued him in weeks past, so maybe be a little bit careful with him. Brian Burnham may struggle again this week. He gets Brandon McDonald and Marco Iannuzzi, a guy who gets a lot of balls, but he doesn't catch a whole lot of balls or make a lot of it with that. Justin Cox, who had a great game last week.
Yeah, Iannuzzi, again, one of those strong side of the field. And when we say strong side of the field, obviously that's the wide side of the field. So if you're looking at the receivers that do line up on that side, it's the guys in the depth chart that are listed on the right side of the page. We put out the depth charts prior to every game. So if you're looking at the depth chart as you're listening to this podcast, guys on the left side generally will be lining up on the short side of the field, whereas the guys on the right side, that's where you'll see three receivers line up outside, four receivers line up outside. So a very long throw for some quarterbacks, that could be as much as a 60-yard throw to these wide side guys.
Could have some trouble playing in Saturday night in Regina. Will Anthony Allen or Jeremiah Johnson might not have a heyday at running back. Durant, if he's probably going to be looking away from Ryan Phillips. I'm just saying, whoever's on Ryan Phillips, which is Ricky Collins, he might not have a big game this week. So Darian Durant has been known to throw picks that way in years past. It's kind of funny. I don't know why. Some people just have the guy's number. Ryan Phillips has had Darian Durant's number for years and years and years. Naaman Roosevelt is going to be little yell hell this weekend. Going head-to-head with him. John Childs will get TJ Lee. Another tough one. Lee is right up there with the premier defensive backs in the league, and Rob Begg's going to get Lucius Purifoy, and he might actually get a few yards because of that. Yeah,
he could be a sleeper this week as he gets checked down targets from Darian Durant. The Obviously, what you've seen in his progression is Naaman Roosevelt is sort of that main guy, and then he'll look across. And last week it was Ricky Collins, but like you said, Ryan Phillips, if Darian Durant wants to throw a pick six, he'll throw Ricky Collins' way and watch Ryan Phillips take it to the house, because look up the articles. There's plenty of articles on the internet about Darian Durant's past struggles against the Lions halfback, Ryan Phillips, their entire careers against each other. So Rob Begg could be a safety valve for Darian Durant. And then the last one I'd steer clear of is Shamad Chambers will probably line up most of the game against Brandon Stewart. And Stewart's a great cover guy that could take away the big Rough Riders target. And then lastly, the running back, Curtis Steele. Honestly, when I look at this one, I look for one name in the BC depth chart. Watch for Mikhail Brooks. You saw it last week without Brooks in the lineup for BC. If he is able to go, then Steele could have a tough day. If he is out of the lineup, you could see Curtis Steele get a combination of carries and targets well into the 20s and be a big guy for the Rough Riders.
Steal of a deal. He could be a big one if Mikhail Brooks is out of the lineup. Packed show we had today. A shout out to 110% Podcast as well, who continuously help support our product. So thanks to Jordan Karst and those guys. Give those guys a follow and listen to their show. Any final thoughts for you tonight, Dan, the Stats Guy?
Well, we tried to lay out these matchups for you, and I think we're learning more and more as the weeks go on of who to stay away from, who to sort of target in terms of those matchups. It's the key thing to look for is where the guy lines up on that side of the field. On Tuesday, our DFS rankings will be out. Get yourself a subscription to those. It's only $20 Canadian. If you're an American listener, do the conversion yourself. I'm not even sure the amount on that, but it's a very cheap deal
like
for you.
$1.50.
Yeah, I don't even know what the conversion rate. We may actually have to pay you to get the subscription if you do it. I think if the conversion works out, we'll give you our useless Canadian dollars. But sign up, get your rankings. It's just another tool that you can use as you decide on your roster. We don't know everything. We don't, jump on our pedestal and say that we know exactly how everything's to go, but it's a cheap option for you. It's only $20 Canadian for the full year. So sign up for that at onsidecfl.wordpress.com.
You can also follow us on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and TuneIn. And as producer Dan has his final saying, he wants 5-star ratings is what he's asking for. That's his soapbox, and we'll happily give him the knuckle tap for that. Also, on behalf of Engineer Ben as well, thanks for the acting job there. You can follow Dan on Twitter at Dan_UK1, myself at Dave Dawson7. We are at CFL Fantasy FTB. You can check us out online, onsidecfl.wordpress.com. Thanks so much for listening. Enjoy your football this week. Lower Your Weapons by Revolution Engine again will take us into the evening. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.